Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars video. This is going to be my review for The Mandalorian Season 3 Episode 6, which I overall thought was a very fun, enjoyable episode, but I can't really disagree, at least entirely, with some of the issues that have come out with this episode and with the season kind of overall, which is that, yes, there isn't a lot of, focus necessarily. There's a lot of, here's a whole episode about this and we're not really doing anything else. Din as a character has not really been, he doesn't necessarily have a character arc or a goal or a motivation at this point. He's just sort of there, still involved in things, still being, the main character, but he doesn't have a goal. Bo-Katan's goal and sort of the general goal of the different groups of Mandalorians is what the focus is right now, and it's feeling like he's fading a little bit into the background, but he's still always there. So the question is just sort of are they trying to ultimately build and do anything with Din, or is this just what Din is? He's this character who sort of happened to come into contact and become friends with a lot of very, very important characters, and so he is important just because that has happened to happen. And so overall, he is just the kind of character who sort of connects everything together, even though he himself is not meant to be the leader of Mandalore, the leader of a gang or anything like that. He's not meant to have these grand things happen to him. Bo-Katan is the one who's being set up as being the future, the leader, the true leader. Do I think they're going to reverse this and somehow make Din the leader of Mandalore? I don't really think so. And I think that's sort of part of the point of the character, is that you don't know exactly what he wants to do, because his arc, he accomplished it, basically. He brought Grogu to Luke. Grogu made his choice and then came back with the Mandalorian. The Mandalorian then redeemed himself for taking his helmet off, and now he's sort of doing what he wants to do, which is sort of just helping return kind of Mandalorians to prominence, and he's doing that by helping Bo, who's executing sort of to some degree the grand plan of the Armorer to ultimately retake Mandalore. And the question is obviously going to be what is the more significant role? The show's called The Mandalorian, so he's going to have to be involved to more of a degree. But I think it's just people waiting to see what arc he necessarily has. With Grogu, for instance, where are we ultimately going with Grogu? Because the grand scheme plot would seem to suggest that at some point Grogu gets captured and they take some of his blood, DNA, and this unlocks part of the kind of cloning project that they're working on. But beyond that, what is Grogu's goal? Does he want to become a Mandalorian? Does he want to become a Jedi? Is he meant to be potentially the next Mandalorian Jedi? That's a mix of both. We don't exactly know. Because they're the two focus characters, the two mascot characters for this show. But the writing is telling you very clearly that Bo-Katan is the focus of this. And even to some extent, the Armorer is a very, very interesting character if she has a kind of deeper goal, a deeper motivation. But, that stuff aside, I still enjoyed what we got here. It's just that it is episode 6 of 8. There are only 2 episodes left for them to potentially do some sort of a resolution, big step forward with Bo-Katan's plot, and potentially bring some sort of a Din plot into play. But let's get into this one. So it's obviously a kind of oddly structured episode where, once again, we have an episode that sort of is bookmarked by 2 relatively small scenes in terms of just minute count in the episode, where we get our main plot, but the most of the middle of the episode is sort of a side plot. But it's different this time because it leans more on the kind of filler side of things, whereas the Dr. Pershing episode was sort of just focusing a large part of an episode on characters who have not had a lot of the spotlight. And so it felt weird because it's not The Mandalorian, but it's still important content. Here, it is very literally a side plot where they are diverted from literally landing next to their main goal, and they have to do a actual side mission before they're just allowed to go over there. So it's very kind of video gamey what kind of happens here. I like the plot that we get here. I think it could have been explained a little bit better, but like it was fun, like start to finish. Like I want to make that very clear. And then I do think in just a small amount of minute count, they managed to do quite a lot with just the opening section and the end section of the episode, because they made progress. Like we're not taking episodes upon episodes to locate, find, have a whole plot associated with Bo finding the kind of troops who abandoned her. It just sort of happens all in this episode. The lingering plot of the Darksaber seemingly gets mostly resolved in just this episode. Now, I think there's maybe a little bit more to go with the Darksaber, but I do, to some degree, view it as just like this is always what they were setting it up for. Again, I understand. I think people want Din to be more of a chosen one type character. But it was so clear he is not suited for the Darksaber. He doesn't seem to be making progress in terms of becoming more skilled at using it, whereas Bo-Katan in just a couple of seconds demonstrated that she is incredibly skilled with it. That she is the one who should have that weapon. And there is an arc there to it. Now, I think they probably do need to show the backstory of what happened, but I think that's probably the overall plot we are building to. Moff Gideon has been broken out, and I'm pretty much convinced that he's been quote-unquote freed here to rejoin up with Imperial remnants, and we're building up to, I think, sort of the second battle of Mandalore, the second Night of a Thousand Tears type thing, where we're going to get Mandalore being retaken, and either in or around the timing of this, either directly when it happens or shortly after they've settled the planet a little bit, Moff Gideon, I think, might attack again. And so they're building up to, I think, we will get the full history of Bo and Moff Gideon, how the Darksaber was lost the first time, and sort of highlighting that Bo's arc over the course of this season is going to build to her redemption, I suppose. Her potentially defeating Moff Gideon in combat, and the kind of the true direction for Mandalore being decided after this. I think that's the ultimate trajectory that we're kind of heading on here. So I will start with the sort of bookmarked scenes here, just so we can focus in on what most of the episode was actually about at the end. So at the start, we basically get, okay, what is Bo-Katan's troops? What are they doing? They're mercenaries now, we were told. And here's them doing some mercenary work. So they have the whole fleet that was taken, of course, Imperial stuff, so that they look like an Imperial remnant, but they're just Mandalorians. And I think this scene was good to highlight that, yes, they are mercenaries, but that doesn't mean they are, like, evil. It doesn't mean they're bandits. It doesn't mean they're pirates. They're being hired to do a job, and in this case, the job is to get back the Mon Calamari prince, who, you know, the Mon Calamari royal family views as having been taken by this Quarren ship captain, but actually he has run away to be with his love, basically. And so we get this sort of Romeo and Juliet-esque romance between a Quarren and a Mon Calamari. Two species that have been, like, historically enemies in basically every conflict we've ever heard about in Star Wars. So this was a quite significant one to just like highlight that to a certain degree. Also, it shows, you know, they weren't being brutal in how they handled this. They didn't kill anyone. They had a conversation. They came aboard the ship and they just grabbed the guy and left. It doesn't seem like they like hurt the Quarren, damaged them in any way. It was literally just them getting in the way of this relationship, but they did what they were paid to do. And that's fine. So I think that given that you were ultimately going to go down the direction of having them join up with Bo, follow Bo, you couldn't go down the path of overly making them villainous. But there still remains the lingering plot point of we don't know who actually freed Moff Gideon, and that group is Mandalorian related or adjacent, but we'll get to that. So that's all fine. Then we get the sort of resolution from the previous episode of like, okay, Bo-Katan walks both worlds. She's going to unite all the tribes. She's going to bring the other Mandalorians to us. Well, is she doing that on her own? That was almost the implication, is that she's going off on her own. But we get the idea that no, the Mandalorian is going with her. Grogu's going with them. This is the team that we've had for most of this season. Fine. Makes complete sense. He's sort of been sort of off on his own as sort of more of the main support character, which seems to be his role while he doesn't have his own arc. And that's exactly what we get here. Yes, they arrive at the place where the fleet is, and the side plot happens, which we'll get to, the main plot basically. But when we finally come back around to it at the end of the episode, we basically just get them walking into camp. We find out that Axe is the one in charge. We also have the kind of Sasha Banks, Mandalorian Casca, as well. She's there, and it's a pretty large group of Mandalorians. Again, they're all ones who take their helmets off and stuff like that, and they're a bit concerned seeing Bo-Katan walk into camp because, of course, Din is with her. They view Din as like a cult member, basically. So, of course, this is where the Darksaber gets brought up, because they are a group who, one of their Mandalorian culture things, one of the few things that seems to really matter here, is they view their leader as being the one who holds the Darksaber. Whereas the Darksaber doesn't seem to be a particularly important thing for most of the way kind of the covert Din's kind of group. They don't seem to particularly care about it. Like Paz Vizsla, because of the whole Vizsla connection, cared about it to a certain degree. You know, the armorer like appreciates the Darksaber, I guess, as a quality weapon to a certain extent. But they value the keeping their helmets on as being a more significant thing than the Darksaber, whereas this group is all about the Darksaber. This is why they left Bo-Katan in the first place, and what they still talk about here. So basically, she challenges Axe for leadership of the fleet. They have a pretty cool kind of Mandalorian fight here. They both have their helmets off. They just don't use blasters. Everything else seems on board here. They use kind of melee weaponry, shields, the flamethrowers, grappling hooks, the even rockets, and so on. All of that stuff gets utilized. Bo-Katan eventually pins him down and wins. But he still makes the point of, like, you don't have the Darksaber. Like, this means so little when the guy over there has the Darksaber and will never view him as the leader, even though he has the Darksaber. And so this is how they do what seems to be the resolution for the Darksaber, which is that you think what's going to happen here is that Din is just going to hand the Darksaber over to her. And history is repeating itself. You can tell there's a little bit of a gasp from everyone with the idea that, really, you're just going to hand it to her? That's not how this works. That, in a way, the bad luck that has happened to this group of Mandalorians, they almost view as coming from the fact that this is how Bo got the Darksaber in the first place. Like, Sabine handed it to her, just gave it to her, and it was then taken by Moff Gideon, and all this sort of stuff happened. So for Bo, it's very much a situation where she feels like, and everyone else feels, if she is to have it, she has to claim it in the right way. And now, the way they resolve this is that they don't have Din and Bo fight. I think the setup isn't really there for it. It's always a very difficult one to do it that way, where it's like, these two characters are actually quite close. You have to force them to have a almost pseudo fight to the death, just because the possession of this weapon needs to be in one hand over the other. And obviously, Din would be forced to fight as hard as possible, otherwise, like, the win for Bo doesn't mean anything, and it's hard to kind of do that fight in a way, because, you know, in using kind of wrestling kind of terminology, you know, you kind of have two baby faces here fighting. And either you have to turn one of them heel, which is never going to be Din. The only way they were going to possibly do that would be to have Bo turn on Din, when everything in the season was suggesting that's not the direction. From a very early point this season, it was very clear they were not going to do that. I think if there was going to be something like that, it would have been her, quote-unquote, taking the Darksaber when the actual Mandalore, her saving him, actually happened. But they didn't do it there, and I think that was to highlight that, you know, she has changed and evolved since she last had the Darksaber and is a different character now, even from her previous appearance in like season 2. So Din points out that, wait, back at that incident when we went to Mandalore, I was captured. I was basically defeated and captured by one of the inhabitants there. Bo-Katan was the one who arrived and saved me. She defeated the person who defeated me. She claimed the Darksaber and used it and was extremely skilled with it. By that logic, I lost it and she gained it from the person who defeated me. That should fit the requirements of what's going on here. And it very much does. Now, some people will view that as being a little bit of a cop-out, that they wanted the Bo versus Din fight. But I think that makes sense. Like, it's this kind of ritual that is followed by the Mandalorians. Yes, it's a technicality, but that is the rules. That's the way it works. It's just the fact of the situation. And it is complicated because, you know, there's technicalities across the board about, like, well, if Din's logic isn't fine, why was it okay in other times when it happened? Like, we've seen the Darksaber exchange hands on a few different occasions. Like, Darth Maul defeated Pre Vizsla. That's how he got it. They had a literal duel for leadership. Darth Maul won. He claimed the Darksaber. The Rebels characters sort of like came into possession of the Darksaber by virtue of like meeting Darth Maul, but like I forget the exact details of that, but like you wouldn't necessarily say they had a fight with him over leadership of like who should become the leader of Mandalore to claim it. It was just like Darth Maul stuff happened, but the Darksaber's right here. We have it. Sabine had it. She then gave it to Bo-Katan, who kept it up until, I guess, the Night of 1,000 Tears, when she was defeated by Moff Gideon. Again, we don't know the details about that. In that, like, was that a proper, like, honor duel? Did she lose a fight against Moff Gideon? Or did he just, like, steal it after, like, they captured everyone? And then that gets into the whole idea of, like, okay, so if in a random incident you get captured, the leader can claim the Darksaber as their own, and it's viewed as being the same as kind of having defeated the other person. And there's all that sort of stuff. And, you know, then Din beat Moff Gideon, and so claimed it from there. And, you know, we have what happened with Din, of course. Now, you could maybe make the argument that, well, Din technically, quote-unquote, lost fights to other characters, but in a lot of these situations, like, this was the Darksaber was kind of taken from him. He was captured, and most of his equipment was taken from him, which is why Bo-Katan was able to come in, pick it up, and use it against the person who defeated Din. So I don't really have an issue with this kind of like quote-unquote cop-out, you know, technical explanation of the Darksaber, because I don't think they'd set up Din versus Bo enough to actually happen. She now has the Darksaber and has the leadership of her kind of former companions. The question is, from here, where do they go? So obviously they're going to return to the covert, which I assume will be returning to Navarro. And we're going to get, I guess we'll have to get, the interesting moment where the big groups meet. How will this work? Where we have the covert meet the kind of mercenary Mandalorians, and we see the clash of cultures and their different views on being a Mandalorian. How are the likes of, I guess, Din, Bo, and the Armorer going to handle this sort of like integration process? And this is where you wonder what's going to happen in terms of like one group doesn't really care about the Darksaber representing the leadership of the Mandalorians, but does care about the helmets, and then it's the reverse for the other group. Are they going to find some way to mix this together? I assume there'll be a general sense of uniting over the idea of, we have proof Mandalore is inhabitable again. We can only do this together. Mandalorians work best together. I think Bo even said that in this episode. That's what we need to do. And I think they'll all be for that, ultimately. And we'll probably see a few kind of scenes like that. I don't know. I wonder, like, will we have situations where maybe they relax some of the things and we see some of the Creed members take off their helmets, that sort of thing. I'm not super sure. Because again, it puts the kind of Din situation into kind of play again, where what's he doing? He's supporting Bo-Katan, but like, is he going to then stay on Mandalore? Because they pointed out that, you know, Axe kind of said it. He doesn't have a drop of Mandalorian blood in his veins. So in terms of like it being a thing that stems from a specific planet, he's not related in that way. But Bo makes the point that no, he walks the way just as much as any of us do. That like, you know, you're all like mercenaries here, whereas he actually like follows like a very strict creed of being a Mandalorian. So like, there's an argument that he's kind of more Mandalorian than you currently. So there's that whole thing that they're playing into as well. But do I think they're eventually setting up Din to be the leader of Mandalore? I'm not really sure. I don't get the impression, at least right now, that he is necessarily that character. He is capable of like leading to a certain extent, but he is not like the battlefield kind of leader. He's very much just the sort of like the acquaintance of a lot of very, very important characters, that he can organize things to happen that a lot of the other characters, because they're more interlinked to a specific group, kind of can't organize. And I think we've seen that a little bit, you know, as the kind of season has gone on, that like what ended up actually like saving Navarro was like Din's connections to all these different groups. That's what ended up making this work. But is that a show that it should be him as leader versus Bo? I'm not really sure, but I think it all depends on like where they eventually go with the Moff Gideon stuff. And like I said, I think they're setting up that they'll get a foothold on Mandalore, but the success will be ruined by Moff Gideon's re-arrival onto the scene. Now, this is where I think you're going to have to introduce something like, I guess, Imperial Super Commandos, or another group of Mandalorians which is maybe loyal to the Empire, and you're probably have to go into some of the history with some of this stuff. And I don't know, is this where maybe they reveal who the Armorer actually is? And little bits and pieces like that do begin to happen. Because, it still comes back to, like, are we doing anything with Din and Grogu in the remaining 2 episodes other than them just being there connected to this because they're connected to this? Will they jump into the forefront and the spotlight? Who actually knows? But let's jump into the middle part of the episode, most of the episode, our side plot here, that we are quite literally, the ship gets taken control over and driven away from our end goal. But we end up meeting the leader of this planet. This is Plazir. And we find out that, of course, okay, the wife is the kind of one who actually has the connection to this planet. She's kind of like royalty, kind of like nobility there. She's the Duchess, I believe. And then we have Jack Black as the former Imperial guy who's not connected with them anymore, who's married her. So they're just kind of like the rulers of this planet. Now, the thing with this planet is that they reveal is that people are allowed to basically follow their passions here. You don't need to work a job as such, because they have a large amount of droids who do all of the kind of typical work you would expect to be done. So that's kind of part of the setup for this episode, that they reveal that what they need the Mandalorian and Bo to solve before they can meet up with their private military force, which is Bo's group, is they need them to solve the issue of why certain droids are kind of developing problems and causing issues kind of across the world. So this begins this kind of investigation mystery plot point where Bo and Din team up to find out what's going on here. Grogu is straight away left with the Duchess, who kind of lures him in with some like fish kind of like treats here. So as expected, Grogu abandons his kind of father figure for food here. but in the process helps the Duchess enough that he is knighted by her at the end. So Knight of Plaisir Grogu we have here. So that's a fun little plot. But again, like Grogu's involvement in this episode is pretty minimal overall. So what we get here is that we get the what's his name? The Commissioner Hellgate we go to first. He shows them the videos and explains the kind of situation on the planet, droids acting out. And some of these seem to be as simple as just a droid carrying a bunch of boxes, dropped the boxes and started like ripping up the stuff. Some of them are like one of the transports just crashed into a wall. Worse ones are like, you know, a chef bot started, I guess, cutting people, which is a little bit concerning. And so the first place to go is basically down below to the Ugnaughts. They're the ones sort of behind a lot of the programming. Talk to them about the kind of next step. And so we go down there, and there's some nice references throughout all of this here, where we get like Bo is kind of taking command of the mission, but she can't really get through to the Ugnaughts because there's a little bit of an accusatory tone to her voice, whereas Din quickly realizes that, oh, Ugnaught, I know how to talk to Ugnaughts. You have to really respect their craft and, you know, reframe it as, look, well, we're confident that you've done everything right. We think there's something more going on. We think people have like sabotaged your work, and so to protect your work, you guys should help us. I have spoken. And that was nice, referencing Queel to get that brought up. And Bo even notes that, like, you know, what was that? Like, and he has to point out that, like, yeah, you get used to, you know, talking to people in different ways. And that's sort of the skill that you'd say Din has that, like, Bo perhaps doesn't have, is that he could talk to Jawas, he can talk to the Ugnaughts, and because he's a bounty hunter who's maybe been around a little bit the place more in terms of traveling, he knows some of these more kind of like tricks of the trade type thing. And so, you know, that was a good use for the Mandalorian, kind of showing that there's the unique skill set that he has that other people don't have, but there are things that she can do that he can't as well. So that's somewhat interesting. But anyway, this basically kind of just leads them to, you know, they find some of the droids around the place. There's an inspection being done on them that we find out what like the super battle droids are. And again, you see the different way in which they do things. Bo's trying to do more of a formal investigation, whereas Din just starts being like, I know a way to do this. Let's just start pushing over some of these droids and seeing which one actually like breaks out and does something. Eventually he knocks over a super battle droid and it kind of runs off. Eventually they find out that the droid has this what would you even call it? What did they say? It was like a spark card or something like that on it for a droid bar called the Resistor. They go there. This is actually quite an interesting scene because we get this kind of almost idea that, oh, are these droids in on it or what? But actually no. They really value having this kind of space to themselves. They like helping humans because humans made them. So they're okay with a lot of the kind of things that are being done on the planet, like reprogramming and stuff like that. They're not behind this. Like what's happening in the bar is not like what's causing all of this. So that was an interesting one to sort of get that almost like droid perspective where like, yeah, they're programmed to a certain degree to speak that way. But you got more of maybe a bit of an honest view on their situation, which was somewhat interesting. The main info they get here is that the thing that the droids come to the bar for is this stuff called, what was it, Nepenthe? And it's effectively, they say it's like a lubricant that also has within it this kind of like substance that like assists with the programming, the reprogramming. So they eventually get the kind of analysis done on the droid, and they realize that there are nanobots within the Nepenthe, a specific batch of the Nepenthe. And this has been sort of changing the programming to make these droids act out. There's another bit of an incident where one of the droids goes rogue at this point. They quickly solve that. which eventually leads to them getting the revelation that, oh, nanobots are in this. Nanobots come from the Techno Union, so it's kind of separatist era kind of stuff here, and it was the commissioner who was the one who brought these nanobots in from kind of deep storage, basically. So he's revealed to be behind the whole thing. So they go back, they confront him, and this is where the plot gets to me a little bit like, wait. Have I just missed something, or is the plot literally just this basic? That his motivation was just that he didn't like the way the planet had gone, where people relied on droids for everything so much, so as well as a little bit of an issue with the leadership, that like there's a former like Imperial here, how things have changed since that guy turned up on the planet, and so he just wants to disrupt the way the planet is right now. But he seems very still focused on the droids. He doesn't really come across as the type of character who wants to get rid of all the droids because he's in charge of them. So he just goes on and basically reveals that like he doesn't like the New Republic, he didn't like the Republic, and he didn't like the Empire. He survived all of that, they won't take him out, and it's revealed that he is a separatist. His loyalties, that's where they lie. He's a separatist, he's a Count Dooku supporter, that literally gets referenced in this episode. And literally, it feels like the line of dialogue that he was about to say was he was cut down in his prime by the Jedi Enforcer, and I'm assuming the next words he was about to say was Anakin Skywalker. But Bo-Katan really quickly uses this as an opportunity to hit him with a shock dart. And I'm not sure if it was just this was the specific timing she chose, or did she not want him to say that out loud? I don't really know. I forget if Bo-Katan... I don't think Bo-Katan would be familiar with the details between like who is who or stuff like that. Bo, of course, knows Ahsoka particularly well, but I'm not sure about the whole Anakin connection. I need to kind of look that up again. But anyway, I still am not really sure like what his motivations necessarily were. So he ultimately what he caused was some droids to go a little bit rogue and cause issues on the planet. He had a button that was capable of turning all of the droids into their former battle droids. So he basically could have almost like wiped out the planet, like taken control of the planet himself. But until he was captured, he wasn't really planning to do that. And obviously the button, I think previously the way it worked was that this was just the shutdown button for all of the droids, which he obviously didn't want to do, so he changed it. So he wasn't fully against how droids were so much the focus of things, because they never fully said that like he wanted to make it out that the droids were flawed so that they'd be replaced. Maybe this is where the whole droids, like the droids were also worried that they would be replaced in all of this. Is that, I think, what the actual takeaway from this was meant to be? That he was trying to show that like the droids were so flawed, we can't rely on them to like control so much of the system, basically be in charge of so much of like how the planet actually operates. He wanted more kind of humans in roles. They could have been just a little bit clearer about like what the character actually like wanted to accomplish. Instead it felt like, oh, we need to get to the Dooku reference, the Separatist reference before anything to make this actually happen. In the end, he gets exiled to the moon of this planet with the idea that overall the Duchess seems to be a somewhat forgiving character. There's maybe a chance for him in the future, but it was very much a side plot. In the grand scheme of things, the actual details of what happened on the planet don't matter too much, because it was just to get permission to finally speak to the forces, which sets up the end scene of the episode. But like I said, I enjoyed it. Like all those little things, like the Mon Calamari, Quarren reference, the Separatist reference, some of the kind of different species we got to see, the fact that we got to see normal battle droids, Separatist battle droids, super battle droids and stuff like that. The scene with the droids in their droid bar was quite interesting. Overall, even the Ugnaughts, like lots of references to Mandalorian specific stuff, but also kind of Clone Wars era stuff and so on. That all kind of worked for me. But I think it would have worked better if we knew there were more episodes of The Mandalorian. I think knowing that they devoted like 80% of one of 8 Mandalorian episodes to this plot, that's sort of where the issue slightly comes in. So if there was a little bit more room in each season of The Mandalorian to have one-off episodes like this, I think things would work a little bit better. Whereas you maybe feel coming out of this episode that like the bookmark can actually advance the plot forward scenes very much just felt like, and here's your required plot progress for the episode. Because I think coming out of this, I really feel that why don't they do something like this? Like, imagine a Star Wars show that is more one-off episodes, and it's just these, like an investigation style Star Wars show, where we just, every week we just go to a planet, and there's just an unusual sequence of events, and some sort of a conspiracy, something like this with maybe a little bit more depth to it, because the whole episode could focus on the mysteries. That would be kind of cool, almost like a crime procedural focused a little bit more on full-on like mystery. So like a Professor Layton type thing in Star Wars, I think would work quite well. Now obviously you'd need the right characters to be your kind of detectives ultimately, but there's a lot of potential here, because we've seen that this can work. Like Attack of the Clones, Obi-Wan investigating, certain Clone Wars episodes worked quite well. This one ultimately I think quite worked. So the idea of this episode works. It's just that at this point in the season for The Mandalorian as a show, I get why there's this little bit of a sense of like annoyance that like, why did we spend that much time doing that on very much a literal video game kind of like side mission type thing that we got here, where we were literally diverted away from our main goal, which we could have got to like 5 minutes into the episode just by this plot needing to happen. So an odd episode where like I enjoyed it, but I also understand from a format sort of season structure point of view why there's a decent amount of like issues with what's going on here. But to me, once they can deliver with the final 2 episodes and get us to a really interesting point, I can accept maybe the idea that post season 2, the Book of Boba Fett stuff, and now this has sort of been a bit of a re-getting the show kind of back on track, setting up for the bigger plot to happen in Mandalorian season 4. Some of the stuff maybe from the likes of Ahsoka and what other connected shows they do to set us up for something even bigger. Hopefully they have some announcements later in the week at Celebration for maybe stuff to connect this together, because probably like people will feel a lot better about this if there was maybe a confirmation that like season 4 of The Mandalorian is like happening, and maybe sooner than we think. Because I think a part of it as well is just that there's been quite a bit of a break from even Boba Fett, but especially Mandalorian just season 2 into 3. It's been quite a big gap. And if season 4 was coming a little bit, hotter on the heels of season 3, I think people will feel a bit better about the low episode count and the maybe lack of focus. But they're my thoughts on the episode. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were. But that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.